Hey everybody, it's Roxanne from Champion of My Heart, and today we're going to go through the findings of a recently published study out of Finland on repetitive behaviors in dogs. And the study even came up with a short list of breeds that are more likely to develop these types of behaviors and less likely. So stay tuned for that. But let's start with language and vocabulary for this. And so the author specifically chose to call them repetitive behaviors instead of other terms that you may have heard in other contexts, such as, stereotypic behaviors or compulsive behaviors, kind of like an OCD in a person. And what the authors basically say is that a stereotypic behavior is often a repetition of a motor pattern that may have no apparent goal or function, whereas a compulsive behavior, as we sort of understand it generally speaking, typically does have, it's the repetition of some what we would call inappropriate goal. Particularly dogs that develop these behaviors often self-injure, and we don't want them to do that. So those are other words you may hear around this type of behavior, but the authors wanted us to know, authors of the paper specifically wanted us to know that they chose to use sort of a broader term of repetitive behaviors in dogs. So let's take a look here. I was having trouble getting the slides to change. There we go. All right. So here's the paper I'm talking about. It's called Aggressiveness, ADHD-like Behavior, and Environment Influence Repetitive Behavior in Dogs. So what you want to know about this is it's a study of about 4,500 Finnish pet dogs, anywhere between the age of 2.4 months and almost 18 years old. Families reported their input for this study through an online questionnaire. And of those 4,500 dogs, 1,315 were reported as displaying repetitive behaviors, and the majority of them, 3,121, were reported as not displaying these repetitive behaviors. And just for a little context, prior research has estimated that about 16% of pet dogs show observable repetitive behaviors. So, that's kind of the prevalence we're looking at there. The authors of the study broke down, wanted to discuss the categories of repetitive behaviors in dogs because they're different types of behaviors. So, locomotory basically mean movement, things like circling repetitively, chasing their tail, pacing for no apparent reason, chasing lights, which is really common in my breed and border collies, as well as freezing in place, like dogs who just freeze and then kind of get stuck. Another category is some sort of oral fixation, right? Dogs often get in a habit of chewing on their legs or feet, licking themselves in various places. There's even a specific kind of licking called flank sucking, where they, focus on a particular part of their body. They might also lick or chew other objects, like random things, walls, floors, their toys, people, I suppose, as well. And another oral behavior is sort of snapping in the air, sort of like imaginary fly catching. Some dogs exhibit what they call self-directed aggression, where they actually growl or bite at themselves, typically their bottoms, their legs, or their tail. Some dogs vocalize in a compulsive way, in a repetitive way, typically in some sort of audio pattern, or even whining, humming, almost like they're singing to themselves sometimes. And then they call the final category hallucinatory behaviors, where dogs stare at things, like stare at the corner, stare at the ceiling, stare into a shadow. Or chasing lights, again, can be a hallucinatory thing, because maybe there isn't even a light that they're staring at, but something at some point triggered them to respond to lights in a certain way, and they might think they're seeing lights. So what we know from prior research, possible triggers for repetitive behaviors in dogs, it can come from frustration, boredom, or stress. There have been prior associations with weaning, lack of socialization, and the presence of other dogs, as well as what they call comorbidity with other behavior problems, meaning that dogs with certain behavior problems are also likely to show repetitive behaviors. Hold on, I'm going to drink. Okay. So the researchers who did this study found several demographic, environmental, and behavioral variables that increased the probability of repetitive behaviors in dogs. So let's take a look at what those were. So in terms of demographics, age was associated with repetitive behavior, with higher probability in younger dogs and in dogs over 8. So like young dogs had it, and then there's sort of this arc that kind of falls down as you get to about age 8, and then it starts to come up again, potentially related to canine cognitive dysfunction, which is sort of like dog Alzheimer's. And it's more likely for dogs with those sort of later life neurology challenges to potentially develop repetitive behaviors. Sex. So they literally said, contrary to our priori hypothesis, meaning before they started, there was no significant difference in repetitive behaviors between male and female dogs. Now, what's interesting is other studies have found an association with sex. In particular, male bull terriers have a higher probability of developing these kinds of behaviors. So they were actually surprised to find in their data set no significant difference between male and female dogs. Sterilization, they also found an association with these repetitive behaviors, with intact dogs having a lower probability than neutered dogs. Now, again, what's interesting here is other studies have found that particularly sterilized female dogs at a much lower probability of repetitive behavior. So that's one of those things where prior studies said one thing, this one says something else. So environmental factors, there were quite a few that they found. Exercise. So dogs getting less daily exercise had a higher probability of repetitive behaviors. And specifically, dogs getting less than an hour of exercise per day had a higher probability. So, we want our dogs to get enough exercise. And apparently that 1 hour mark is an important timetable, at least as found in this data. The other environmental factor, one of them, is being an only dog. So they honestly thought this would be true, and the data bore it out, that dogs that were the only dog in a family had a higher probability of repetitive behavior than dogs living with other dogs. So that could be things like they have, higher stress levels from being an only dog, that they don't have that social interaction, and potentially, that's affecting their behaviors. The other environmental factors they found is that if the owner was, if this dog was the owner's first dog, it was more likely to have repetitive behaviors. Now, they specifically come out and say this is a novel finding that no one's seen in other research. So they go on to say, obviously, replication in future studies would need to solidify this finding. So, it's not an absolute accepted kinds of thing, but it is a new finding. So first dog, more likely to develop repetitive behaviors. Family size also played a role. So dogs living in single person households were less likely to show repetitive behavior than dogs living with 2 people, like 2 people household, or in larger families that they defined as more than 2 children or more than 2 adults in the family. And again, they went on to say that this would need to be validated by additional research. So this is the really interesting thing. There are some breed differences. They looked at like 22 specific breeds, and then they kind of, the really popular breeds, and then they kind of lumped all the other breeds and mixed breeds into a third category. But when they did that with the data, the breeds with the highest probability of developing repetitive behaviors, German Shepherds, Chinese Crested, Pembroke Welsh Corgis, medium-sized Spitzes, and Staffordshire Bull Terriers. So those German Shepherds and the Bull Terriers, really, really well known for developing repetitive behaviors. So, again, this may be skewed by the types of dogs living in Finland, but in particular, there is a lot of data that shows German Shepherds and Bull Terriers have the high probability So low probability, then you've got your smooth collies, your miniature schnauzers, legato romagnolos. I have a friend that has one of those actually. They're kind of rare in the US, but Europe, UK area, they're more common. Jack Russell Terriers and then rough collies are also on the lowest probability list. So there were differences in terms of the types of repetitive behavior seen as well. So bull terriers, particularly known for chasing their tails, like just obsessively chasing their tails. And again, border collies, really well known for just staring, fixating on like the ceiling or something, as well as air snapping. So they did find some behavioral factors as well, which is not unexpected. So dogs with higher scores for these other behaviors had a higher probability of exhibiting repetitive behaviors. So things like hyperactivity and impulsivity, inattention to the task at hand, as well as aggression. So in particular, dogs with higher levels of aggression, like extremely aggressive, moderate, whatever, the higher the level of aggression seen in the dog, it increased the probability of repetitive behaviors. So there's some debate. Can we say this is like human obsessive compulsive disorder? And so there are certainly people who say yes, there are some who say no. But here are the ways that human OCD and repetitive behaviors in dogs are similar. Early age of onset is really common. Behavioral inflexibility resulting from executive function impairment, meaning like decision making is not as strong as it should be. They've also found structural abnormalities in the brain, increased blood cholesterol levels, which is kind of interesting, and imbalanced pathways for both serotonin and dopamine. So similar medications and non-medications used, non-med treatments are used in people and in dogs. In particular, fluoxetine, which is Prozac, or clomipramine, which is also called anafranil for people, or clomicalm in dogs. Now, I had a really fearful border collie. The original canine heroine of the blog, Lily, was off the charts, pathologically fearful, and required 2 behavioral medications twice a day, every day for most of her life, just to cope with the world at large. And clomipramine was one of those drugs. And so I'll tell you, from my experience, you can get generic clomipramine a lot less expensive than you can the dog-specific version. So that's what we did under the advice of our veterinarian. But just so you know, so this matters because abnormal repetitive behaviors can considerably worsen the well-being of dogs and impair dog-owner relationships. So understanding all the complexities of the factors affecting canine repetitive behaviors really can benefit people and dogs. And so it's important that we understand the factors that may contribute to them or may be associated to them, again, not cause and effect necessarily, but an association, so that veterinarians and animal behaviorists can develop appropriate treatments and interventions for dogs that are suffering from this. Because I've said this before in other contexts, but behavioral suffering is suffering, right? We help dogs when they're suffering physically, and we need to help them when they're suffering emotionally as well, that then is reflected in their behavior. So these types of behaviors, are damaging. It's hurtful for the dog. It does damage to them emotionally. They often do damage to themselves physically by obsessing with these behaviors, doing them repetitively. So that's why it's important. And that's it for today. So thanks so much for your time and attention, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care.